So welcome back everyone to Tazeen TV. I am so delighted and deeply honoured to bring you a conversation with Elizabeth Anne Hin. Beth is founder of the White Rose Foundation, and her mission is really to support global consciousness, to promote inner and collective peace, and to really help increase harmony amongst humanity. Beth, it's an absolute honour to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tazeen. It's a joy and an honor for me as well.
Let's begin with something that you have touched upon, which is this time of deep uncertainty and deep unknown that we as a human collective are experiencing together, and individually really it's become a time where we're all having to kind of learn a new way of receding and relinquishing control, and to accept that there's another power at play, albeit a little virus, or as through our conversation, really the higher power, the only power.
Yes, I think as the pandemic occurred, began to commence in the last few years, it's something which has been spoken of by scientists and physicians for a long time. And we are in a period of human history, which Sir David Attenborough refers to, I think, as the Anthropocene period. And he comments very wittily and wisely that it's been a wonderful period for the human being, as if much of what we've constructed of human life has been for our own benefit or our own sake of not necessarily what we find to survive in balance, but what we find more for pleasure. And so if we take this period of time and we go for your generation or your children's generation to the future, how might we sustain a balanced human life as we go forward? There are many people upon the earth. We appear to be in a phase of climate change, which is always occurring to some extent, but seems to be occurring in a way partially caused by the nature of how we live. So I would speak of this time as more like a disciplining parent calling one's child to a certain virtuous behavior. I had a mother who was very noble, and her methodology of parenting was through example, and then a quiet way of showing alignment. So if she were disturbed, she might let one of the four of us children know by admonishing us. But if we weren't paying attention, she would become quiet, not punitively quiet, not punishingly quiet, but reserved until our attention came back to ourselves and we realized, oh, we are to increase the maturity of our own alignment as ourselves, but beside our mother. So it was partly her mothering, but it was also according to each of our temperaments. And so if I observe the world right now, historically, we go through surges about every 20 to 35 years of great wars, enormous famines, vast lessons, which are very melodramatic. And we poise ourselves according to our levels of power and accomplishment, either through heroism or material grasping or material saving or loss, according to what happened to us or our ancestors through those times that were extremely adverse. And most of our stories, historically, of all nations are based upon the ebb and flow of those dramatic interludes. And yet, in the highest spiritual path, the drama is considered to be of very little significance. It's the ongoing thread of eternity, the Holy Spirit, the internal practice, and the virtuous expression of the soul and heart through every opportunity, every loss, every gain, so that a constancy of grace is practiced. Oh, am I grace-filled enough that I am receiving grace? How grateful I am. There is enough water. Would you like a cup? And we offer that to the prison guard, the prisoner, ourselves, the farmer, the king, the courtier. We don't say, I have all the water, or I'm dying of thirst because you have all the water. That's what we tend to study historically, so that we can teach our children what to do if someone keeps all the water or ruins the water, pollutes all the water. But the answer for balance and for actual realization is from the grace-filled experience during the dramatic time. So if we look out through the entire world right now, the whole world is paying attention to this illness. Whether we know what it might do to any one of us or not, we are all paying attention. There's the quality of several phrases have been used, the great pause, or Duchess Catherine wrote a beautiful book with the National Portrait Gallery called Hold Still, a project of photographs. I think 31,000 people in the United Kingdom took photographs so that they could portray some expression of their experience of the drama as we hold still and breathe and practice in prayer and virtuous life to the best of our ability. What is one to do through this particularly interesting time? And a great deal of what happens in the temporal parts of us, the parts that are born and will die, is we try to find, well, what will happen when it's over? When can I get back to the way I used to know myself? Or how can I gain more than my neighbor? Or how can I make sure my child is in a very good school? Or that my mother is all right and doesn't become ill from this or die from this? So we tend to make a game of winning out of the time rather than realizing somehow the human being has already won and not entered a third world war. That's an enormous expression of consciousness. If I take the various people with whom I was privileged to study over many decades, almost every single one of them would speak to their homework. They were a generation which was to help mentor us beyond a third world war. They appear to have succeeded. Their prayers, their ceremonies, their classes, their manners of life in their tribes, villages, cities, cathedrals, synagogues, mosques, temples, they embodied a principle so deeply and in an adequate collective relationship with one another that together they formed a body of civilization as peacemakers. Their names were many names: mathematicians, philosophers, professors, housewives, farmers, ranchers, scientists, tribal medicine men. And yet, what occurred through them, among them, is a quality of grace embodied adequately that we're not fighting through nuclear weapons or grenades or guns. We don't have a blitz in London right now, nor do we have one in Berlin, nor do we have one in Hiroshima. We all have the virus. So when we turn to one another, what we're really doing is asking, are you all right? Am I all right? I need you. Do you need me? We need to find what in this next most mysterious moment, most mysterious time that has joined the entire human civilization. What is he doing up there? What is she doing? What does that great one mean by all this? Does heaven have our attention? So heaven has my attention. I can't answer for everyone else, but as I observed what was occurring all around me and what would cross my desk, wonderful stories, terrible stories, terrified young people, people threatening suicide at young ages, great fear, losses of occupation, losses of homes, gains in the stock market to achieve wealth. With the ebb and flow of what would cross my desk was very dramatic. All kinds of levels of experiences, from death, people who have family members who died from COVID and would work with me to try to put a funeral together where only 4 to 8 people could attend, or would not be allowed to come into the room where the body was in case they could, a pregnant woman could catch it from her father so she wouldn't go to her own father's funeral. And then she would say, but I'm the one who was closest to my dad, what should I do? So the experience of tremendous human pathos, the great passion of caring and loving, and how could each of these beings live to embody that love virtuously? Because the form in which they would have embodied it before was taken from them in many instances. They could not express how they knew daily life in quite the same way. Yet they did not enter warfare. So there became a quality of transparency, of something, I would say, sculpted by grace, not by disease, but by the grief which grace causes when it strips us bare from what we thought was protecting us from death. Okay, this in a lot of your great traditions, we come through birth or the great festivals of our lives, blessings and birthdays and marriages and congratulatory graduations or accomplishments at work for a number of years. And we enjoy those, but when we cross the threshold of a dying child or a stillborn baby, or a mother who finds she's not going to be able to have a child, or the loss of anyone loved to us, we tend to hesitate at the threshold and say, no, or not yet, or not your way. We somehow think, I think I have my way, I want to do this, but usually we don't know what that way is. I call it the tantrum. We just go into the tantrum. No, my way. And really, if we were not here, but sort of more with God, we might say, what do you mean your way? You don't know what you're doing. You've never done this before. How do you know? We think, well, I don't, but I'm terrified. Because what if he takes me too? Or what if he takes my father also? Or what if she takes the husband as well as the wife? Or what if the husband leaves the wife because she can't have a child? And we try to enact a drama rather than to be the reality of the story of God. So as we entered this particular last few years, I observed the lives of several people with whom I was privileged to study. The late Stephen Levine is one of them, and Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who's still alive in his mid-90s in Hue in Vietnam, where he was educated as a very young monk many decades ago. And both of these men studied many forms of spiritual practice, but Stephen was very well known. He died several years ago. His widow, Andrea, is still alive, and as far as I know, living in northern New Mexico in a very contemplative life. But Stephen became known for working with death, not just about dying, but dying into the next moment, that the artifice of what we were projecting crumble, and that we allow grace to sculpt us through breath and love into holiness, into our being students of heaven's holiness. He wasn't saying that he was holy, but he was a student of that state. I don't even know if he would refer to it as holiness. He might call it reality or just coming into being. And Thich Nhat Hanh worked with several of the late teachings of the Buddha. He was a great scholar, and he would read the old Vietnamese, and then he did a lot of translating of the old Vietnamese vernacular into modern Vietnamese. And he looked back at the old Pali canon, the language the Buddha wrote in, and then, or disciples of his wrote down his teachings. But then it went from Pali to Sanskrit. So Thai would look at the vernacular Vietnamese, translating into modern Vietnamese, but he would look at the Pali and Sanskrit and realize these great teachings of the Buddha go back to the Buddha's late years when he himself was suffering. He had been poisoned. There was a famous dinner where a man was attempting to have the whole close circle poisoned. And so the Buddha famously asked for the whole platter of mushrooms and ate most of them, but kept the rest for himself so that no one else would consume the poison. So he didn't die from this, but from that time on, he had damage to his system. So he would often teach lying on his side. If you ever see statues where he's lying, holding his head, or he's kind of reclining, he's in his latter years teaching after being poisoned. And he would comment to Ananda, Ananda, I am sorry, I am suffering, I must lie down. Remember when I first read that, I was so moved. He didn't leave his faith or practice, yet he acknowledged what he had lost coming through that toward death. Right? So what the pandemic has caused in us is this practice possible for us, that we are at this transparent window or doorway. And most people very sanely say, I'm frightened of this. I'm trying to find a successful answer for my daily life through that window or doorway. How do I make a livelihood? How do I stay alive? How do I keep my family alive? How do I find meaningful work and afford our daily bread? And what do I do next? And what's truly interesting spiritually is it's very hard for people to find those answers. But if we go back to the pre-pandemic time, I wouldn't say it was easier to find the answers. It's more that we had a collective agreement in society of a style of how to do that. I will exaggerate a little bit, say, let's make it like a soap opera. Someone would say, I'll own a shop and I'll hire 4 workers. And it'll be really great because people will come to buy things, even if they don't need them. But if they need them, that would be great. But if they don't, it would be great because then I'll make more and I could have 6 workers and then I could go to the beach twice a year instead of once a year. And we kept exaggerating this. This is called Maya in Hinduism, illusion, an illusory story rather than a true story. The heroine or hero practices to transparently embody the real story without fear, although there's mystery. He or she does not know what to do next. Yet, if the hero or heroine always practices the breathing and becoming of the alignment with heaven into the next moment, it is always revealed to them the virtue of the alignment. That's really all that one has to do every moment, every human being on the earth. And then the answer for the pandemic is through that window or doorway. It's not difficult. It's just that very few of us have practiced deeply those esoteric methods of being. They're not hard. Any child could practice this. There are sophisticated ways to speak of it, but really, if someone breathes, pays attention to the spiritual heart and to the soul, and to letting those line up, may my breath, my heart, and my soul embody virtue within my being, surrendered or offered to heaven, on behalf of my ancestors and those of all of humanity, for the sake of the children of my own heart, soul, and body, and those of all of humanity, for the earth and all of her creatures, her trees and plants, her elements. And then may I be guided with what to do. And then we enter the day in this form. We begin to find that artifice falls away from us. So we are exceedingly vulnerable. And very few people are comfortable with being vulnerable. We translate that vulnerability means I could be hurt, wounded, humiliated, harmed. But actually, vulnerability means we can be touched. And so there's a quality where embodying virtue vulnerably, but with dignity or self-respect, allows us that hero or heroine's pathway through the day. And we realize this is a hero or heroine without warfare. And something in us realizes I'm not being harmed, nor do I feel in myself the will to harm, even through arrogance or the difficult sophistication in much of the world culture right now that is very aggressive and tends to be, rather than collaborative, often tends to be condescending, or where one person will conquer another, or not allow an equanimity, but always have someone as the upper hand or someone as less or more. That part also is not really real. We've just composed a certain idea of that. I talked with a young woman last week where she was very aware of that kind of almost hierarchy of people in films and music. And she would comment, well, that's an A-list actress, but that woman, she's only a D-list, not even a B-list actress. So that's an interesting way for you to be thinking of everyone. And her own fear was, what if I don't meet a husband? What if I don't find a home like these 4 women who were moving from Los Angeles to Austin, Texas, who were long friends? They were living a life she's wistful for herself. If we turned where she could not be afraid, she might see, oh, they're setting a virtuous example. How wonderful for me. So they become sisters together. And we could say, well, what if they aren't the same way in response? But when one practices, as the Buddha did, or as Stephen Levine did, or his wife Andrea's widow, or Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, when one practices this, one is practicing it both very individually, so it's intimate. One is practicing it for the sake of all beings. So one is looking and listening for God to answer back. And I promise you, God will always answer you back. So you have a woman here who's almost 70. I'm not really old, but as the kids say, you and Dad are nearly old. So they've said that for a number of years now. You're not old, but you're nearly old. It occurred to me in the year before the pandemic, I thought, I'm coming to the age where I met a lot of my teachers when they were the age I am now. And I thought, I thought of them as elders then. Well, they sort of were. They were showing me like a grandmother or grandfather or great aunt or uncle. This is a traditional yet innovative way in which I practice virtue. And then as their youthful person, their protege, their apprentice, I was learning beside them. Oh, grandmother would fold the quilt like this. Grandfather would tell the story of the loss of his brother in the war like this, so that I might live to never enter a war, to try to see all men and women beyond any war that would take anyone's brother or sister. So our traditions and our heritage are an enormous valley of remembrance for us. And yet, in every generation, there are nuances of eternity calling us forward into a new day. So for you, in your generation and your children's generation, there is something mysterious in you that is not really fully present in me. I am more to shepherd you. Tazeen, go forward in God. He will answer my prayer for you. She will answer it directly to your heart. That great one will protect and be the answer embodied in your children. I know this is true. It is always stronger than any warfare. It's not the peacemaker, although it has aspects of that. It's the person who existed before any war, during any war, and after any war. It's a part of us that is of heaven on earth. And then when we practice this, we become saturated in the heart and soul until all of a sudden an awakened expression, a gesture, moves through our life in one moment, and we realize, oh, I understand, like this. And then we have another moment, oh, I could be kinder to my neighbor, like this. I could let go of that aspect unnecessary in my life, like this. It's like flower petals opening on a blossom. You know, the bud occurs of any flower, and it starts to open, and then all of a sudden, it's as if the flower sort of falls open in that offering or surrender of itself to the sun. So we do the same in God. At first, we're struggling. Stephen Levi would talk about this. We have this tension. We're holding ourselves. We almost hurt from the suppression of consciousness. And then we fight over ideas. Well, I'm not opening up to him because they're from the wrong culture, company, neighborhood. You know, I don't like their sense of humor. They voted for the wrong person. They told me the wrong time for the train. I'll be angry with them for 12 years. We form an idea of righteous separation mentally. And the degree of that righteous judgment also separates us about that dimension from God. And then until that is proven to go a different way, I'm not playing, I'm not engaging. And we become even more contracted. So we can observe, oh, they told me the wrong time, I can't believe it, I'll miss this meeting. Or we think, did they do it intentionally because they're jealous? Even if they did, even if something happens out of malice, we can be greater than receiving the malice and becoming the fire of hatred and anger back. And recognize, how do we do this? Where we form an answer in ourselves that calls each person awake in two sides of the battlefield. And we're not interested in the drama of separation because we don't want God to ever leave us. We want to be the place where that remembrance is fulfilled. So if one's senses are always attenuated to this, then there's this beautiful ebb and flow of a very quiet ecstasy. And it's not an ecstasy that just brings contentment. It brings an increasing maturation. So it's very hard for people in the pandemic because they feel, what is that going on? I don't know what this is. I've never experienced this before. And I think, well, no one has. So if I take a person like myself who has 7 decades of practice, and I realize it's such a serious, deep, yet beautiful experience for me, then what is it like for someone who has no practice at all? It's either exciting or terrifying. Because their muscles are starting to be formed to be natural contemplatives. Right? So in mysticism, this what we call this era a descent of grace. There are times scholars study and people of faith all over the world about the descent of the Buddha to his mother. And then she died 8 days after his birth. She bore him holding onto a tree. Her sister raised him. His wife followed his practices and taught their son every day of his time away until he became enlightened. Who became enlightened? Where did it arise from? The mother and the aunt and the wife and the son and the Buddha and the Bodhi tree and the tree under which he was born? We go, oh, the Buddha became enlightened. I'm not so sure. I think it's a larger collective. And then what happens is we realize, oh, I'm moving with my study of enlightenment to perceive God in all of them, and the trees, and myself. when various prophets have come to us in the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, we speak of these movements of grace, a descent of grace. And then we study the nature of what that is in a prophet, in Moses or Abraham or in Yeshua, Jesus, or in Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. We study, what is this that happened? And I think that too much of the global perspective has become an intellectual one, where we want the mental judgment so that we go, I'm safe from what happened to them. I'd like to see what happened to them, but I want to also be safe. And then we feel safe from people whose beliefs differ a little bit from our own. And of course, every human being will be a little different because each of our minds is a slightly different vehicle. But the place of that descent of grace is one. And then our mind goes, what do I do with that? Just receive the blessing. And the blessing that occurred in Moses didn't just happen for the Jew or Christian or Muslim. It happened to the mountain. It happened where St. Catherine's Monastery is, and the burning bush, the plant that is still there, the descendant of which is still there. And we think, what do you mean it happened for everyone? I go, it happened for everyone. So it isn't about the belief, although the belief is respected. So the rabbi or the priest or the nun or the imam or sheikh is absolutely respected, or the sheikha. They are representing a traditional way in which we know how to receive part of the grace. And then I go, well, how do we let that be that when we practice that it may be remembered so that it could bless everyone. And then we become that instrument, and we become much less afraid of the pandemic, because it's guiding us to something universal in the human race, the place we all come from or go to. And then not so much is there death, is there disease, but what is this which can open us up to be more merciful as a global civilization, more thoughtful, respectful of the priest or the sheikh or the rabbi or their wives or husbands or children. Or we didn't learn to do that before because we've studied so many tribes fighting rather than working together, but we don't seem to need warfare anymore. We are everywhere on the earth, able to communicate. So it's an archaic instrument, the weapon. So the vulnerability opens us to go beyond the fear and say, well then, if I practice this mercy and call forward the remembrance of God in you and in myself, what are you and what are I and what are we to do then? And where we're afraid to receive it is we're afraid, what if I'm too humbled by it? What if it's not powerful? What if it's not deeply prosperous? What if it's not famous? What if it's not? And of course, it usually isn't. Right? So much of Stephen's life, or much of Thich Nhat Hanh's life, much of my own life, are actually quite modest. But we are so fulfilled by embodying that principle. Right? And none of us know all the lessons. Ty and I had a conversation years ago where I told him that I had gone to Vietnam. I said, I was allowed to come into the country on the way back from a conference in India, and I went to these places that were very important to him. He was not allowed to go into the country for very many years. And I said, you're going to go back there in your lifetime. And Sister Feng, who has been his right-hand person for 70 years now, said to me, Elizabeth, are you crazy? There's no way that they would let him go. And I said, you mark my words, you will be allowed to go back into the country and welcomed. How did I know that? How did I know that? How did I know to go and pray for one of my spiritual fathers to be allowed to go back? I wouldn't say it was important to me egotistically for him to go back, or to him. He was always homesick, although he made great peace with the whole world. I just went and took flowers to places where one of his teachers had self-immolated, had burned himself in a Bachunduk, I went to the monastery in the cities where Ty had studied as a younger man, out to the country areas where he had gone. I went on a pilgrimage because he couldn't go, but I could go, so I went. Just for several days. Blaine was with me, and it was very beautiful. And then I knew they will have him come back. I knew God answered me. And then I just said to him, I know that you will go. I just knew, I, your daughter, I know in my heart and soul and body, spiritual father, that you will be welcomed back to your spiritual home. Right? So even if he had not gone back, something about the map of the soul was allowed to be healed or restored. Right? So when we know this and we do this together and we embody that virtue, we are beyond all fighting and warfare. It's just not that interesting anymore. We only did those things because we thought the person from the next tribe would kill us or harm us. They go, you're not going to harm me? I go, no, I'd like you to be able to be my neighbor and you. And they'll think, but what if your child does better in school? What if your brother gets the job and my husband doesn't? What if I go, well, they might. But then we will still have to study, what do we do in our heart and soul and life to meet this mystery of God, which is equally in you and you and you and myself, in Thich Nhat Hanh and myself, and Stephen Levine and Andrea and their children and myself. And then if we follow that principle, it's modest, but respectful. It will never fail. But we are formed into a pearl by it, a modest pearl. And we tend to go, I want to be the important pearl, or I want to hide. And we form a projection, and we form a mask, an image, a projection that is not real. And then we show that to other people. This is who I am. And this era has that kind of being stripped away from us. So we're unnerved by how vulnerable we are, showing our real self, which people work for many years to awaken. Yeah.
It's so intense, Beth, because behind the mask, it's, as you said, that vulnerability that through trust, God willing, we'll get more comfortable. But it's also come at this time where you've got social media, we've got technology. So I'd love to hear what comes through you about actually the inner battle, the sort of taught holding of fear and love.
Yes.
And not so much the battle with the other, although of course that's what most of us are more familiar with. But the battle to hold on to the remembrance, to remember to keep turning.
We tend to think that we don't exist, or we're nothing, or we're nothing special if we don't have an external importance. And so it's, it starts very young. I remember being a very little girl, and someone I know wasn't invited to a birthday party. The equation when I was a child was that if you were allowed as many children as your age. So if the child were 5, there could be 4 friends plus the birthday person. And so one of my neighbors didn't get invited to somebody else's birthday party. And I remember their mother was just so upset because their 5 or 6 or 7-year-old was so upset. And my mother had them over at our house and was saying in the kitchen, it's all right, no, it isn't all right. The child was just thought they'd never be all right because they weren't one of the children chosen. But they weren't even that close to the other child. They just wanted to go to the birthday party because it was fun and there'd be birthday things. And so I think the 2 mothers did something to make cupcakes or fruit salads so that their child and the 2 mothers and, could do this. And I wasn't that interesting because I was too young to be that interesting to the one child who was like a year or two older than mine, but their suffering was real. They were devastated. They weren't important in the social media of the day,
Mm.
even though they weren't close to the child who was having the party. They still wanted to be included. So in us is a longing for all the parts of home we can't remember. And so for most people, they feel as if they're pushed out into a world that is interesting, but not home. They can't find home. And when they try to create a sense on earth of that which would be a spiritualized yet actualized earthly home, they feel that it's not enough, or I don't have enough income, or I can't get a good enough job, or I bought a chair, but one leg was broken, or the fabric was not sewn in carefully, and then the store is unpleasant about it. There's like one thing after another happens where we can't render it home. So we have an idea in metaphysics, all the places between heaven and earth, which is where all of the human psychology exists in those spaces. It's like all the space outside of the physical body between us and heaven would be the metaphysical worlds, let's call them, the philosophical worlds. And so in those realms, one of the deeper parts of the mind is a witness consciousness aspect that is observing everything. And it looks at what is real, but then it does something to take a perfect image of what it thinks it should be. And then we decide, if only it could be the perfect image, everything would be all right, even if it's not heaven. We think, I'll take it, I'll build a life that's all of these perfect images. So rather than staying with a meditative witness consciousness state where we're just observing, we tend to come in and say, I don't just want to observe, I'm here. I'm going to assert it with my will. And then we say, rather than surrendering to God or being offered, which means I lose, but it doesn't really, but that part of our mind likes to trick us and say, well, but it won't be a birthday party and I'll be left out. So we justify, well, I'm sort of surrendered to God. Then I think if we use the word, maybe I will offer myself to God. Then there's not so much the sense of our having a tantrum then. I'm not trying to reject the word surrender, but I think for how we play games with ourselves and our egos, we'd say, well, I'm offering myself to God. And that part of my mind that wants to take the perfect images, I don't need to, but I can create beauty. So whether it's social media or our homes or our bodies and our fashion, or the concepts about our work, or the sophistication we want for our children, or just the survival we want for our children. Just that we want them, if I'm working with someone in Gaza or Israel right now, and their child has nothing and they don't know what to do. It's like we follow the same principle of going to the virtuous places of the soul and the heart in the daily life. And we realize I am of heaven on earth, and my mind's eye will create a perfect image to try to show me a direction which gives me hope and gives me the willingness to try to embody God's will on earth. That's really the direction. So when we come in and take 50 pictures or two and put them out onto Instagram or Facebook or whatever, any social media, I'm trying to just name one or two social media aspects, or anything in the press, or we have a photograph of a model in a magazine or in a television program, which is very lovely, and we realize that she simply is that lovely in her face and form. One of my old friends I grew up with was so much so that she would have people just stop in the street. Someone would see her and it was like she was so inspiring. It would just stop someone. And she knew it's a gift, but it was hard to walk down the street for her. So she'd wear a jacket with a hood and put her hair on her face and, tuck her hair in, and we'd walk down and go to get coffee. And then when we came in the door of the cafe, she could throw her hood back and push her hair back and sit down. And so the quality of what we're trying to project tends to become, if I show this, I will win the war against death. I will not be left out of any birthday party. I will win a competition.
Mm.
And so there's an extreme amount of competition right now over the earth. Who gets the earth? Who's going to devour it? So this leads to a serious moral question. And so part of the practice is for ourselves and for our progeny and the future. But also, it's to set an ethic at this time, or the bad guys, the ones that go, it doesn't matter what happens to Tazeen or Beth, my children will be billionaires. And they will, and I don't mean that being a wealthy person would be bad, but my children will be billionaires partly because I will treat other people less, and partly because I will devour much more of the earth than is my portion. And I will enjoy the warfare I cause the whole human race, as if I were a great Tyrannosaurus Rex. So my answer to those people is, but you're not. Please remember God beside me. So when you walk into your corporation, or your marriage, or your loss of your marriage, you become awakened in your soul and heart and practices virtuously beyond warfare. For the sake of this classroom we're all in, the sake of the entire cosmos and the earth, because of the Great One, because of God as Father and Mother. And we practice in that way. So not everyone has to do this, but I think for anyone who does do this, there becomes an existential contentment rather than an existential dread. God will answer you very quickly. Not necessarily 24 hours a day, although he might, she might, they might. But you'll feel, I feel it, I feel the grace. And then you'll realize, oh, I have to continue practicing. Not practicing with an arduous intensity of heavy discipline, but practicing gracefully, lovingly, lightly, with the sweetness of gratitude. I am alive. This moment is beautiful. I am grateful for this moment of life. I have shoes, or a sweater, or an apartment, or a room, or a homeless shelter, or a lovely home. I have a sibling, or a spouse, or an elder, or a child. I am to practice beside them. And then we know in the next moment what to do. But this warfare you're talking about, this arduous time on the earth, is very real. And so there is an enormous chess match going on among the nations and the corporations to see, well, if we did this, we could sell this company. If we repressed this, we could conquer that country more deeply on socioeconomic levels of warfare. So one of the aspects that I have found very disheartening the last couple of years is my companion, my spouse, John, is a physician, like an old-time family doctor, like an old-time country doctor in the city. And I say that because he's very sophisticated in medicine, yet he's a very modest man in his attitudes and coming from the countryside and a life that where he was taught a very deep sense of moral structure, like a compelling care of the 95-year-old patient being as important as the businessman who comes in and has to get on a flight in an hour. Couldn't you see me first? No. But I might miss my flight. Well, should have thought of that when you made the appointment. And then he's like an old cowboy. And he has said to me that his life is one of the least changed lives he's seen through the pandemic because he just goes into work every day, which he's done for 43 years. He hasn't missed a day of work due to illness in 43 years. So it's so interesting. Every day he goes through his ritual and then into work. So an innovative idea will come in. They're doing research on the antibodies. They're one of 2 labs chosen. It's a very modest lab. So they're working on an answer for the antibodies in one's own body. And yet he's in and out with the daily things as the pandemic wears up, pandemic quieted down, wears up again. So he's noticed that he's been able to stay rather constant in his manner of practice through the whole era. And then he'll say, I'm so grateful we didn't have to let go of one staff member. It was very hard for a few months, but we were able to sustain them. There's people who've been with him for 30 years in the office. It's just interesting, the ebb and flow of what's been present there. And yet we will note this quality of one nation will say, no one can come in. And then someone else will say, everyone can come in. And then from people working on the docks and the ships and the shops and the preschools and the hospitals, they'll say, I lost my job. I had to close the shop. And then someone else will say, we made 4 times as much money by shutting this down and tricking these people. So there's this argument going on throughout society, and that would be the warfare. There is a war going on in power and greed. And it is very real, and it's very ugly, and people do know what they're doing. There's a gorgeous idea in most of the world's faith traditions that says between the ages of 4 and 7, a child begins to come to the age of reason. He or she has rise up within their soul and heart the knowledge, Mama, this would be virtuous, this would not. Okay? So beyond any mask any of us wears of artifice in society or of projection to stay safe or try to show an external identity, if we could live where we slowly let those masks become transparent until we don't need them anymore, and we live with asking one another, is this virtuous or is this not? We all know the map of where the world might go. And I just believe we need to hold one another to that. And then if someone doesn't follow that, I respect their path, but I'm not walking with them. I'm following the lead of my mother, my late mother. Well, I would silently go on in virtue to the best of my ability. And at a certain point, one of the people falling down badly will either realize that they don't like where they're going very much, or that their fame or glamour are not really impressive to me. I don't have the slightest interest in where they're going. They're not coming from home, they're not going home. They're not actually helping someone's path. And yet, someone needs to show them the way by example, right? The hero or heroine in each of us. So rather than doing battle on social media about those people are bad and he did this and she did this, the following of one's own alignment and setting the virtuous life forward modestly but nobly, with joy, with contemporary interest in all kinds of things, fashion, music, play, cuisine, home decoration, gardening, working, on levels from basic survival to great sophistication, whatever level God has made your life at, to bring that forward with great creativity and meaning is wonderful. But to find the places in oneself to fine tune till the heart and soul become like a glorious pearl. And then to set that example, calling that forward in other beings. So nothing about you is for sale in the marketplace. You're not interested in being traded, right? And then someone will realize, wait a minute, I would like to be like Thich Nhat Hanh is like that. There's nothing in him that would have been interested in being traded. It's not what he's doing. It's not what Stephen is doing or was doing. He's not alive anymore, but it's not what Stephen Levine is doing, right? So people think, wait a minute. And then they start being disturbed in themselves. Their own conscience has been addressed by a brother or a sister who will not have it. I am not watching the world of Tasnian's children fall. Not on my watch. Nope, not interested. And then I'm not trying to tell the other person what to do. Because what's so interesting about this era is a lot of it has to happen within each being.
Mm.
So what makes it so interesting, we think, what is going on out there? So there is somehow a descent of grace or an awakening of grace, like a fruit ripening. The human race is ripe enough to know what to do now everywhere in the world. And then you'll watch a person come forward. The former president of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, his former wife, Mackenzie, came forward and decided to, as they went through a divorce, she would spend the rest of her life doing good for mankind. Well, interestingly, Amazon began in a garage funded by her parents, and she managed all of the company for the first maybe 7 years. So even though we know his name, it came from her parents and her. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it reminds
So
me. Mm.
just it's just interesting. I'm not trying to disparage him, but I go, interesting. So what is Mackenzie doing now? God bless both of her parents and his. God help him find his way to what I would call a greater morality than I find him living. I'm not to be his judge, but that quality of what is projected versus the nature of what might be done. And yet there are many good things he may have done. But something about the seed of this occurred through her and her parents and him. So several months ago, I ordered books for several renowned people in England, just elders that I knew were very isolated. They were famous professors, and it was just important to me that someone reach out to them. So I did them through Amazon UK because I could get the books to them. I tried Blackwell's, and I got one book from Blackwell's to go to someone, and then I had to go through Amazon. But I was aware in practice of the professors, of Mackenzie, formerly Bezos, now she's remarried. It's like all of us are like part of that weaving together. And then all of a sudden something happens where we or another person who was falling gets up. Historically, we would go through this argument until we had a war. I hate you, well, I hate you more. I hate you more, well, I hate you more. Until it built up, and then we fight, and then we bomb each other and kill each other. And then we go, okay, are we finished? And then we put the pieces back together in a slightly different form and go on with lessons we didn't learn, and with karma, some scars, the scars of the woundedness and the lessons of awareness. And that's our historical pattern. So most of humanity is trying to recreate that. Okay, how do we do this? I go, well, beyond war, actually. We think, well, we've never done that before. I go, isn't that something? The Hopi Native Americans and the Zuni and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples would say that this time would come, and the Havasupai people in the Grand Canyon. This time will come, seemingly out of nowhere, beyond war. We must be ready. We must pray and practice and do ceremony to be ready and to call humanity forward when it's this time, or the earth will not withstand it. The earth will not be able to support us anymore if we don't line up and do this together. The earth will no longer be able to be the classroom if we fail this. So they felt they had the assignment to be the priests overseeing this. It's very beautiful, very, very serious also as an assignment of work. So when we do this, when we go beyond warfare, we go, well, then how do we do this as nations together? It's not that hard to collaborate, but there's no winner or loser. There just is the removal of the mask and going, here we are. I thought we were different countries or different states or different religions, or our beliefs were different. I go, well, they are, but we're studying the same Buddha or the same Muhammad or the same Miriam or the same Yasadar or the same, Guru Nanak or the same great medicine woman. And we go, we didn't learn that there could be such a harmony. And then we go, but what about our grasping possessions? so someone else doesn't grasp more. And there's a balanced way to be with attempting to have prosperity and to care for one's daily bread and to save and be grateful, and to learn to do this where we don't enslave one another and don't objectify one another, but bow to the place of God in each other. How should we do this together? And then we find our way forward. I think I just, when I was a young woman and worked with different people in a number of cultures, I would just come into them, and I had experiences with native tribes in Alaska who were very silent when they would first meet me, and they'd watch me with their children, worked with their children. So I kind of was known about all over the state of Alaska. But when I went out to other parts of the world, I would come into an area and a tribal person would just somehow welcome me into the area. And other people would ask me, well, how did you do this? And I would note that I didn't really think I did anything. I just was vulnerable and modestly respectful of the culture I was entering. I wasn't trying to make anything about the culture like my culture. I was just entering for the purpose I was there for, say, working in medicine and in social care, like a sort of working with refugees, I'd say. But even the doctors would say something like, but the people are working with you. And I said, I think it's because I'm not seeing them as different from myself. If I come into the hospitals at a refugee camp in northern Thailand, if I come in and start to set up the beds in a ward, the doctor would say, but the men are coming and helping you. And she goes, I've been here for a year and they don't do that with me. And I said, well, I think that they don't see me as, I'm not a doctor. I don't think they see me as the doctor. They see me as an older sister or mother or grandmother, and they're helping her. And I am letting them. They are important to me. Right? We are meeting together to caretake that hospital for everyone there. And the same thing is happening on the earth now. So we need the brilliant minds that run nations and corporations. And we need them to take care of everyone and their own family.
Mm.
They can say, my daughter has beautiful designer sandals. I go, that's so lovely that she can have them. And your manager's daughters have sandals that are appropriate for them. You're not making this much money and them this much money. You're not enslaving their daughters to your daughter. You're training them to be sisters in society whose brothers do not have to fight in wars. And then the Y chromosome of the men drops its weapons. Even the dollar bill or the pound or euro or all the different monies across the world. They drop those as weapons and use them as experiences of trade. Like when we come together for a meal, a shared meal at the end of Ramadan or Christmas or any celebration throughout the world, Hanukkah, Passover, and we say, may I serve you? May I serve you? So I think that metaphor for serving God and one another brings forward the conscience, and then we call forward in prayer, in ceremony, and in how we, to the best of our ability, because none of us are perfect, only God would be perfect. And for the atheist, I say, well, let the universe be perfect.
Mm.
And let yourself be a dewdrop of the universe so that you uphold virtue even if you don't pray. So that for the person of faith or the atheist, we still live in prayer or offering of ourselves, and then the alignment of that prayer, that meditation, that contemplation, and then the practice of virtue. And then what happens is God moves through another person and through us, and an answer comes between us. Enlightenment has been studied historically in the individual, not in the collectives. So what's happening now is an awakening of righteousness, maybe in a couple or a family or between a parent and a child. So people go, what is this? It has always occurred. I gave that story about the Buddha and all the different women around him, the trees, but we haven't been taught that in a theological way. So wherever we have a prophet in the Western faith past, there are always is a circle of people around where many things are occurring through a handful of people together. And yet most of our faith and practice turns to one form. Let us turn to Jesus, or let us turn to the Buddha, let us turn to Krishna, or let us turn to the founder of the Jain faith, or let us turn to Lao Tzu, or let us turn to Confucius. And we speak of communist countries as if they were godless, but East Asia is extremely of the Confucianist and Taoist principles. Tremendous ethics, going back to Confucius, the original ancestor of all of the Chinese people, and his wife. So if we all come from that and live virtuously, what do we find there? What I would call heaven. The Chinese person would also call it heaven. I would call it God. They might say, I don't believe in God. I go, okay, well, let's go back to heaven and Confucius and his wife and his colleague Lao Tzu, through whom Taoism was formed. And we start moving as a culture together and think, I didn't know we could do this together. I go, that's just because we weren't taught that way. So we've been taught our religions as if they were different tribes that had to be at war, or different factions of different tribes that had to be at war. When actually it's like siblings of one family. Oh, this brother knows the map of Mongolia, and that one knows the map of Iran, and this one knows the map of Africa. Isn't it wonderful, such a family? Right? So in living and working with other peoples, I would simply ask them, what should I do here? Or what are we having to eat here from the market? Or how can I bring the medical supplies over here to that village? And so I would not have things stolen from me on the black market. Why? Something was meeting. I don't mean that there's several times when people tried in several nations, and then I was able to talk them out of it. We came to a level of conscience where they would just go, all right then, all right then. Right? The virtue was able to always adequately meet. I could talk to someone where that didn't happen to them, and I could say, I'm so sorry for that scar occurring. One I have is a child asked me in a little village in Ethiopia years ago if I could send him some books on math and sciences. He had walked about 10 to 15 miles from his parents' home to live in a little house with a couple, and they would let him stay there if he swept the floor and took care of certain things for them. He had one little bare light bulb. He was allowed to study until several hours after dark, and he had used up all the books that there were in the village. And I couldn't send books to him without it costing me about 5 to 10 times the cost of the books. But also, I couldn't get them there without them being stolen. So I've never forgotten him in my prayer that somehow, somewhere, God brought the books, God brought the education for that boy. Right? It's never left me. But I couldn't physically, in adequately virtue, get the books physically to him. So these samskaras, these places where we can't quite get through the doorway, still are aspiring to the best of our ability to embody the principle for the sake of everyone. And then when we see things in social media or in the press that are very bickering and argumentative and very mean-spirited, we just take a more noble path. I remember walking into a party years ago where some young women were being really cruel to another woman a very sophisticated group of women. And I just walked by them and I said, that was so cruel. That was so incredibly cruel. And one of the women said something like, yeah, so what do you think about it? And I said, I'm not very impressed.
Mm.
And I just walked by. And I knew, I didn't have the same beauty of figure that they did. I didn't have the same sophistication of clothes, but I was aware they were being too cruel to that other woman.
Mm.
I didn't have to attack them, but I did have to observe in conscience this way, right? So one may have to do that silently at times and embody the principle silently of a dignified behavior. And then it's important that you be careful that you don't form a righteous judgment against someone else where then you're in the war for yourself. So it's a deep part of the practice. And I think particularly for people who are about 60 years and younger to maybe 20, your generation is taking shape. It could become great and represent the nations, the principles of possibility for all people, so that this is present in one's person, one's marriage and family, one's home, one's friendships, one's work, how one deals with possessions, cuisine, caretaking the land, every stage of the human life, like a living Buddha, practicing being that. And it's beautiful. It's not difficult. It's more, I don't see anyone really talking about this out there.
Mm.
Maybe, I hope people are, but I thought the last few days, I don't see anyone really talking about this, but this is what's going on out there, right? It's time. It's time. And then children think, really, Mom, we could do this? I go, yeah. When a spouse goes, really, darling? I go, yes, there's nothing else to do. This is the only thing. I used to call this in classes the choiceless choice. This is the only thing really interesting going on the earth. And really, it's the only thing going on in grace on the earth. And it's going on for everyone,
Mm.
all of us, whole civilization. So when we bring this to each person, that beautiful phrase from Jesus, that which you do to the least of my brothers or sisters, you do unto me. I go, it's time everywhere in all of us. And so this is what I'm doing all the time. And long after I'm gone, no one will remember me. It's like there'll be one woman who was here, but that will never be forgotten. That will never be forgotten. That is the remembrance of God, always remembered everywhere. Right? No one can take that from you. It doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to God and you. It's eternal. And then you realize, oh, that signature he was crafting in me, that great mystery, that's what he's doing right now. That's what she's doing right now. So there's nothing to be afraid of because this would be the classroom for all of us. And then only God is left. And I go, oh, well, then let's see what the future looks like in that great mystery that's so unfrightening. Yeah. And then a world leader, a farmer with a very small plot, a person who's lost everything in the pandemic, a person who's gained a great deal. Each one can find his or her conscience or their conscience and be present with, how do I walk that path? And then when they fall down, just get up, come back to the breath, come back to the spiritual heart, the soul, and embodying those principles. And when we do have the gifts of education or prosperity of home or health or possessions or food and vitamins and any kind of excellence, just the gratitude. And then I would say trying to do something to be generous without victimization toward other people. If I have an elder friend, I might send her a book or a sweater, cold climate, or I've done things like that through the pandemic, just quietly that were important to me. I would be able to find something, a signed book of poetry for a young monk who was a student of Father Keating's. He couldn't believe that I had known this one famous poet. And I said, oh, I knew Maroon from when I was 21. I go, I have a few books that are signed by him. I'll send one to you. And then I came home and took my favorite one, actually, and thought, he's the single best read person I've ever met in my life. And he's that young monk up in Snowmass in the mountains who's taking his final vows. And I'm sure knowing him, he put it in the library of the monks, so they all have it. But I sent it to him, right?
Mm.
And then the signature of God is between us and among us, and it becomes infinitely beautiful. And then wherever there's harm anyone's trying to cause, you be the answer that's beyond war and peace, that is the remembrance of God embodied in your breath and your heart and soul, and you'll realize, no wonder it was so mysterious. We've never done that. Even as individuals, it's not how we've lived before, except the hermits up in the mountains, the hidden contemplatives, the cloistered nuns or monks. No one else has done this. Maybe the quiet farmer or rancher who was tucked away, who came into town but actually lived this way in their heart and soul to the best of their ability. But other than that, no one has really lived this way. People would bring the countenance of, I'm here. That's the mayor, he's important. Oh, that's the mayor, we hate him, we love him. Not just, how are you, sir? How are you, madam? And meeting with respect, so that the position of the mayor or the farmer caretakes the city and the farm and themselves and us. And we say, oh, and who am I that also helps to shepherd and caretake them? Right? And then we are constantly nourished by this descent of grace, or this awakening of grace that is occurring for all human beings. And then with your practices, if you have faith traditions, people have asked me, what do I do, with my tradition? I go, stay with your tradition. Stay with your tradition and use that as the muscle, like your workout, your spiritual practice, your language that gives you a beautiful reference for who you are, and respect for your family, your parents, your ancestors, your ways that you've been blessed or baptized, or given the gifts of those blessed experiences. And where you hold it in disdain toward others or fear of others, realize, well, I respect it, yet I'm going to hold the place of calling forward all human beings and seeing as best we can, meeting through all the languages we have of culture, continent, race, religion, until we form the pearl of out of the many one. Yeah.
So beautiful, Beth. So beautiful. And through Kabir and Camille Helminski, which was how our connection came.
Yes.
Their words just stay with me, which is only in the remembrance of God does the heart find rest.
Yes. And it will never fail you, never leave you. I've never seen Camille fail that. Kabir also, but I thought the other day, it's a woman thing, I think, the feminine sisters. I thought the other day, the love I have for them, and I thought I've never, in the way she and I are with each other, it's just, I've never seen her fail that. It's just who she is. It's like the signature of who she is. Yeah, Camille. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. So grateful. What a truly rich, precious, and much needed at this time sharing through your heart.
Well, my privilege, and as I say, just having been allowed this with colleagues of mine, such as Camille and Kabir, but also with these many elders I've known, it's given me the courage, or just the understanding, oh, this is how I'm to pray and practice. So in the quietude of night, day, no matter what I'm undergoing, I will do my best in this. And so you have a sister, whoever the person is out in the world, you have an elder sister out praying and practicing beside you. My promise is there.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me on Tazeen TV. Now, as a transformational life coach, I help and support those who might be feeling stuck or who just want to connect deeper to their sense of self and purpose. So maybe have a look at some of our offerings, and why not join me on one of our free workshops to begin that journey of aligning and optimizing your life. Now, for those wishing to better their telepresence, you can find out more about our media training offerings. Again, have a look at the website, and I look forward to continuing journeying with you soon.